The Royal Danish Navy has a long and proud tradition that is more than 500 years old, with its roots dating all the way back to August 10, 1510. For more than 300 years, the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway shared a navy known as the Common Fleet. It was a powerful navy. The two navies peacefully separated in 1814, becoming the Royal Danish Navy and Royal Norwegian Navy. As an aside, Danish naval vessels carry the ship prefix KDM, which stands for Kongelige Danske Marine. However, in English, this is translated to HDMS, or Her or His Danish Majesty's Ship, depending on who is the monarch at the time. Denmark is an extremely important country in strategic terms in the context of Northern Europe, given that it is the bottleneck that separates the Baltic Sea from the North Sea or Greater Atlantic Ocean. Even so, Denmark remained neutral throughout World War I, and it was adamant that, like Sweden, it would also remain neutral as World War II loomed. It was allegedly said at the time that whoever controls Denmark controls the Baltic Sea, as Gibraltar controls the Mediterranean. Unfortunately for Denmark, Adolf Hitler and the German Reich were all too aware of the country's strategic importance right on the northern border of Germany. Yet even with the rising threat of the Third Reich during the 1930s, the Danish government decided not to expand its navy or overall military budget. Its fleet remained tiny, with only the coastal defense ship, the Niels Iuel, being modernized in 1933. Unlike some other small countries, Denmark didn't have any larger warships, including not a single destroyer, nor did it have any ocean-worthy submarines. Besides the Niels Iuel, it also had the Peder Skram, a coastal battleship. It further possessed 21 high-seas torpedo boats, but most of the country's coastal defense remained reliant on civilian converted guard patrol ships. By 1939, its entire fleet was a modest 104 ships, with a total tonnage of just 24,069 tons, nearly all of which comprised small patrol boats or similar auxiliary vessels. The German invasion of Norway took the Norwegians by surprise. So too did the German invasion of Denmark take the Danish by surprise. After all, Denmark had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany on May 31, 1939, with Denmark committing to remaining neutral. That was until Germany invaded the country on April 9, 1940, as part of Operation Weserübung. It was just a week after the Germans had invaded Norway. It was par for the course treachery by Hitler and the Third Reich. The Soviets would also find that out when their own non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, became meaningless once Germany invaded the USSR in June 1941. The German pretext for invading Denmark was flimsy, pathetic even, with the Germans initially insisting that they only needed to occupy Denmark in order to lay mines in the surrounding sea. That was nonsense, of course, and everyone knew it. By controlling Denmark, the Germans could control the Baltic Sea, as the saying went at the time. Denmark was quickly overrun by the Germans, and the country would be a de facto protectorate until its liberation by the Allies in 1945. The Danes offered no resistance, with the government declaring that the country should surrender immediately, including its navy. Unlike other countries it invaded, such as Poland, Norway, and France, the Germans did not initially try to destroy or plunder the Danish naval fleet. The Danish Navy no doubt had little of interest for the Germans, besides which the Germans didn't have to contend with the resistance and sabotage that it did from countries like Norway and non-Vichy France. On paper, the Germans allowed the Danish Navy and Army to continue operating despite the occupation, more so than any of the other countries it had invaded. The only thing that the Germans ordered is that the Royal Danish Navy assist in minesweeping the waters of the Baltic Sea around Denmark. The Germans would sweep the north-southbound sea lanes, while the Danes had to sweep the east-west sea lanes for any mines. This in itself was invaluable to the Germans, given that the Baltic was already by then strewn with sea mines. It also helped the Danes by ensuring the safety of shipping lanes for Danish merchant ships. Another thing that the Germans eventually ordered was that all Denmark's torpedo boats and minesweepers be leased to the Germans, in effect handed over to the German Reichsmarine. This infuriated the Danes, who rightly saw this as mocking the so-called sovereignty that the country was supposed to have over its own navy. Ultimately, the Germans only took possession of 6 of Denmark's newer torpedo boats, namely the Dragon, Glenton, Hugin, Vallen, Laxen, and Ernen. To add insult to injury, these torpedo boats were only to be crewed by German sailors. A peaceful handover of the boats anyway took place in February 1941. To sweeten the deal, the Germans agreed to supply the Danish naval dockyard in Copenhagen with the materials needed for the Danes to build 6 new torpedo boats. However, the Danes were skeptical of this so-called German generosity, suspecting that the Germans would just confiscate the new boats once they were finished. As such, the building of the 6 torpedo boats purposefully progressed at a very slow rate, and they were never actually finished by the Danish dockyard. The Germans didn't give a damn about Danish feelings, of course, but this contributed to a rising resentment by the Danish Navy against the Germans. This resentment would come to a stunning conclusion one fateful day in August 1943, which we will get to shortly in this video. As already stated, Denmark did not give the Germans the resistance and constant headaches that occupied countries like Norway did. There were a number of Danish sympathizers with the Nazi cause. Germany's infamous SS even set up a new corps of Danish volunteers known as the Frikorps Danmark, or Denmark Free Corps. It was devised by the SS for those Danes who wanted to fight with the Germans on the Eastern Front. The Danish government even went as far as to forbid the Navy from sanctioning any sailors who signed up with the Frikorps Danmark. This was all done in a spirit of appeasement that the Danish government dubbed its samarbejdspolitik, or cooperation policy. It was rather cynical of the Danes, but the government believed it was the best way to ensure that the Danish population would be left in relative peace. However, even with this collaboration, tensions were rising all the time. Resentment was particularly high among Denmark's Naval High Command, which was seething about how Germany had seized its torpedo boats and other vessels in flagrant disregard of what had been promised. Things came to a head in 1943 when the Danish authorities started blocking German efforts to deport Jews from Denmark. The Danish government also refused to arrest or surrender patriots in the country's small resistance to the Gestapo. This recalcitrance infuriated the Germans, of course. Everything came to a head on August 29, 1943, when the Danish protectorate government resigned en masse in protest of German deportation laws and ultimatums. The Germans took it as the prime opportunity to seize total control of the country and declare martial law. On that very same day, Germany would formally declare war on Denmark, what had until then been its fairly peaceful and obedient protectorate. With the Germans declaring war and imposing martial law on Denmark, the Danish knew one thing: their naval vessels would almost certainly be seized by the Germans. And so, the Danish High Command made a simple yet stunning choice. Either Danish vessels would try and make a dash for Sweden, or, if that failed or was impossible to achieve, their crews would scuttle their ships. One thing was for sure: the Royal Danish Navy was damned if the Germans were going to just waltz in and seize their vessels. The Danish were right. The Germans had every intention that day of sweeping in and seizing all Danish vessels. The Germans were especially worried about the Danish Navy assisting Allied forces in a possible invasion of the island of Jutland. Tensions were so high in the country between the occupier and the occupied that the Danes were indeed primed to switch to the Allies. The Germans were compelled to take charge of the Danish Navy. The Royal Danish Navy knew what it had to do. What transpired was one of the most audacious flee or scuttle operations in modern naval history. Operation Safari. That was the rather odd name given by the Germans for their operation on August 29, 1943, to disarm the Danes, in particular their navy. In typical blitzkrieg fashion, the Germans tried to achieve this by seizing the entire Danish fleet at the same time. The idea was to simultaneously attack and overrun 19 Danish bases and garrisons, known as Caserna. The Danish, however, were more than ready. Their plan to flee or scuttle their fleet immediately kicked in. The orders to do so were given by Vice Admiral Aage Vedel and sent around entirely by word of mouth among Danish officers and crews. The exact words of the order were, "Try to flee to the nearest neutral or Nazi-opposed port. If that was not possible, be scuttled at as deep a location as possible." On that day, 500 German soldiers were prevented from entering Copenhagen harbor for long enough for the Danes to sink 32 of their larger ships. 50 smaller auxiliary vessels and boats were also sunk as a result of Vedel's secret order. Germany would later seize a total of 14 vessels, far less than they had counted on. The Germans were also able to capture 4,600 Danish personnel, although some did manage to escape. The Danes suffered about 40 to 50 injured men, while the Germans suffered up to 11 dead and approximately 50 wounded. 2 hours later, the Danish commander, Paul Ibsen, would declare with pride, "The Danish Navy has sunk with honor. Long live the Danish Navy." Vice Admiral Vedel was forced to resign by the Danish High Command under extreme pressure from the Germans and would then be jailed for what he did. It didn't matter. The Danes had pulled off a resounding operation that stunned the Germans, even if it meant the destruction of most of Denmark's navy. A total of 13 Danish ships were able to flee to neutral Sweden, where they stayed until the end of the war. These included 9 patrol ships known as patruljekutteri, or patrol cutters. 2 other ships escaped to Danish-controlled Greenland. On their side, the Germans did manage to raise and repair 15 of the ships scuttled in Copenhagen harbor, including 4 minesweepers. These would be assimilated into the Kriegsmarine. A more dashing escapade was to be had by the HDMS Niels Iuel, one of Denmark's 2 larger warships. On that day in August 1943, the Niels Iuel happened to be out on maneuvers in Isefjord, a stretch of the Baltic that branched deeply into the island of Zealand. Isefjord was the only area that the Germans had allowed the Danes to freely use their vessels. Like all other Danish captains, the ship's captain, Commander Karl Westermann, was given the order to flee or scuttle his ship on that August day. Westermann quickly assembled his crew, and it was decided that they would try to make a dash for nearby Sweden. Failing that, they would scuttle their flagship of the Danish Navy. However, she was soon met by a German minesweeper and 2 torpedo boats, as well as a number of Stuka aircraft up above. The Battle of Isefjord was underway. The Niels Iuel was armed with 10 6-inch guns and heavily armored, and so it could put up a fight against the German naval vessels. It was the Stuka's firing and bombing from above that made escape impossible. She quickly lost electricity and her fire control systems were disabled, and so Commander Westermann decided she had to be scuttled. He ordered that his ship be beached south of Nykøbing-Sjælland with all valves released to scuttle her, and all crucial supplies and equipment destroyed or thrown overboard. The Germans would seize the ship by the next day and even arrest Commander Westermann at gunpoint. The Germans may have been able to later raise the Niels Iuel and rename her Nordland, but she never saw service again and would be scuttled for a second time in 1945. In retrospect, the Danes may have tried to appease the Germans for more than 3 years, but things still came to a head on August 29, 1943. On that day, the Danes proved their worth as a sovereign nation, as a proud people descended from those formidable adventurers and seafarers, the Vikings.